It wouldn't be an evening about technology without technology issues. I think we're good to go. Good evening. I'm so happy to see all of these familiar and friendly faces for the book launch on this Halloween, very, very rainy evening. And I'm super excited to talk about the book, Eaten by the Internet, and put its findings in the context of the larger theme of tonight, which is power and the future of the digital society. The book is published by Meatspace Press. You can find a free copy of the PDF online on their website. I also have a limited number of copies with me tonight. And before we move to the book, I just wanted to say a quick hello, so you have an idea of the person in front of you. My name is Karen Kath. I'm a postdoc at the University of Delft, and where I work with Dr. Seda Gürses. I'm also part of the AlgoSoc consortium, which researches algorithmic societies and public values within it. I am a fellow at the Critical Infrastructure Lab here at the University of Amsterdam, and the editor of this book that we are discussing tonight, in which if you find any spelling mistakes at this point, they are truly all mine. I also wanted to thank a couple of people who made this book possible. Joe Shaw and Mark Graham of Meatspace Press, the Ford Foundation, who helped make it a reality, the wonderful designers who helped us out, and obviously last but not least, the authors who submitted 15 wonderful chapters to the book. So that brings me to the book itself. It's an edited volume, so it has 15 short chapters, which essentially outline how the internet is eating into society and why we should collectively care about internet infrastructure as a key technology policy area as much as we care about data, about content governance, about platform governance, and other topics that might ring more familiar than infrastructure politics. And I was lucky to be able to convince 18 of my favorite writers and thinkers to contribute chapters for this book. And some of those contributors include names like Meredith Whittaker, who is the president of the Signal App Foundation, Joan Donovan, who is a misinformation scholar, Susanne van Geuns, who is doing a postdoc at Princeton at the moment, the founders of the Critical Infrastructure Lab here in the front of the room at the University of Amsterdam. And what these authors do is that they carefully describe the changing politics and political economy of the tech industry. And overall, they show in the book how power in the tech industry is rebuilding around the internet's material infrastructure. And how all of us, people in this room, people who are somehow engaged in technology policy, should take note and take action around this. But before I give a short introduction about the larger themes in the book, I also want to tell you something about how the book came about. Because it's easy to tell a really smooth story about my PhD and the interest that I had in internet infrastructure, but we are here to understand the backbone of things, the invisible back channels of things. So that's the story that I'm telling you about the book. In December 2020, we were all in COVID lockdown. I was typing what I think was the 10th draft of my PhD thesis titled final.pdf. I'm sure some of you have been there. I was also 2 months pregnant and generally not feeling so well, facing the dual delivery of a baby and a book. So my friend at the time, Joe Shaw, the editor at Meatspace Press, said, how about we try and make this a bit more fun? How about you design, in addition to the book, you think about a proposal that you could submit to us, in which you could craft a book that is for a general audience instead of your dusty PhD committee. And for my esteemed PhD opponent, Dr. Professor Stefania Milan, who I know is tuning in tonight, please note that dusty were his words and not mine. So at the time, in the midst of my PhD panic, inviting 15 collaborators, co-conspirators, and colleagues to each write a short, accessible piece on internet infrastructure politics that I would then string together with insights from my PhD seemed like a fun and low-key and easy thing to do. That wasn't exactly the case, but now 3 years on, I'm super excited and proud of the book that we've published. I think it's incredibly well-rounded, well-researched. It's a global view on how infrastructure is a key, but yet often overlooked battleground for power in the tech industry. So what are we going to do tonight? As mentioned, I'm going to go over some of the key topics of the book. Then I will ask, the speakers here are already enjoying themselves, that's a good thing. So I will ask 3 authors and 1 expert to outline their chapters and talk about the work that they're doing, and explain how these debates of internet infrastructure are current in also in the Dutch political context. Unfortunately, Gursabat Grover could not make it, but we're very grateful that Hans de Zwart of the Hogeschool van Amsterdam has joined us tonight instead. I will ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves, but a quick intro. Joined tonight we have Niels ten Oever, who is an assistant professor of AI and European democracies and a co-principal investigator at the Critical Infrastructure Lab here at the University of Amsterdam. Fieke Jansen, who is a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam and a co-principal investigator at the Critical Infrastructure Lab. Michael Wiel, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Laws at UCL. And Hans de Zwart, who is a lecturer at the HVA and a founder of the Racism and Tech Center. After they've each given a short introduction, we will move to a panel discussion and then take questions from all of you in the audience. And then, of course, there will be drinks and you can get a copy of the book if you're so inclined. But before we get drinks, I want to start at the start. What is this book truly about? The book argues for a renewed focus on infrastructure as a key locus of power in the tech sector. Or in other words, to understand power in the contemporary internet industry, we must look closely at its often invisible infrastructure. Now, obviously, infrastructure is a word you'll be hearing a lot tonight, and we do have somewhat of a definition of what we're talking about when we talk about infrastructure. So the different chapters in the book take quite a wide view on this, looking at material components such as cell antennas, clouds, chips, data servers, satellites, but also less tangible, but equally crucial standards and software components, including operating systems, browsers, and computing power that enables connectivity. And it rarely attracts attention unless something breaks down. And even then, many internet users won't ask why. Now, this is surprising given how often internet infrastructure, rather than data or content that is accessed through the internet, features in current debates about the tech sector. Recent examples include the ongoing international struggle between the US and China over advanced semiconductors or chips, as you can see here. Another example is the Russian takeover of the Ukrainian internet by forcing local internet service providers to reroute traffic over Russian infrastructure to make surveillance easier. The debate last week in the Netherlands, which saw digital dragnet surveillance essentially reinstituted. The internet blackout in Gaza over the weekend as a result of the ongoing Israeli bombing, and the subsequent civil society campaigns calling to stop the internet shutdowns and call for a ceasefire. The recent raid by the French competition authority of the NVIDIA offices, which is a dominant player in AI hardware and software. And even yesterday, we saw the first hearings in the US antitrust case against Google about the default deals by which Google made its search engine the primary choice for a lot of other software. So what we see is that there are many instances of infrastructure and power, and that these various technologies and companies that I just mentioned are key and play a crucial role in this sector that puts them in the position of power, because there are only so many of these companies. And even beyond that, I'm one slide ahead, beyond AI and chips, the cloud computing industry also comes to mind, which is another often overlooked theme, which is also the current focus of my academic research at the University of Delft, where I work with Professor Seda Gurses and Linda Taylor, who is at Tilburg University. So what we will see today is what Michael Wiel, one of the authors of the book, has summarized quite neatly. This is a partial quote, but I'll read you the full quote. He says, anyone can run a server, but a small handful of firms have a real stranglehold on the large-scale computational infrastructures needed for technologies like privacy-enhancing technologies, including for what devices like phones can do. These include operating system providers like Apple and Google, browser providers like Apple and Google, and app store providers like, yes indeed, here they are again, Apple and Google. So, the internet is perhaps less a communication network and more an infrastructure for control, both political and economic control. Or in other words, it's maybe less about memes and more about market power. And for me, and I think this is what the authors of the book also call upon, is that rather than, or maybe in addition to concerns rooted in data collection or in predicting behavior, we should really focus on making internet infrastructure providers visible as a central force of political power in the tech sector. This is at least what I and the contributors to this book in Eaten by the Internet have tried to do. Now, there are many ways from which to approach these questions of internet infrastructure, and so the book's chapters actually cover a very wide set of topics, spanning from the global politics of content moderation by infrastructure to the colonialism inherent in the space race to plug the moon, from the harms wrought by blockchain companies in rural America to the particularities of online censorship across Asia. And drawing the book together really is this insight, these novel insights into how market power in the tech sector is rebuilding around the internet's material infrastructure. Now, the authors, to be able to do this, take on incredibly thorny topics, discussing power consolidation in the advertisement and clouding industry, the role of internet infrastructure in the war in Ukraine, and tech's environmental impact, amongst others. And what they truly do in the conversation that I hope we can have tonight is one in which we can plug contemporary debates about technology in the politics of internet infrastructure and really ask how we can ensure that our infrastructures sustain us rather than consume us. And on that note, I will hand over the floor to the two experts of tonight, our panel. They'll each tell you something about who they are, their chapters, or their work. And we're going to start with Michael Veal, who entirely befitting with tonight's theme will be joining us over the internet.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be speaking to you. Sorry I can't be there in person to celebrate the launch of this fantastic book. My contribution is around online advertising and its infrastructural dimensions. Online advertising, worth billions, even cross-subsidizes underseas cables. It's very linked to the material infrastructure of the internet. But it's having some changes, having some turbulent times. When you go to a website or an app, you often see an ad, a banner ad, or something similar. Those ads are part of what's called display advertising. And typically, that's being done in a relatively open way, at least by platform standards. Many companies have been involved in many stages of the supply chain to provide these adverts. These ad tech companies have existed often through a system called real-time bidding, where they try and get your attention at that very moment. A bid for which person gets to see which ad happens in the milliseconds, the nanoseconds, sometimes before a website loads. In those spaces, at those moments, we find quite a lot of interference with people's private lives. There's not just data about which websites they visited flowing pretty freely to an unlimited number of companies online, but you also find interference with people's decisions. You find interference with their autonomy, interference with their attention. Advertising does all of those things. So there's a lot of social issues at stake here. The changes have been quite interesting. Data protection regulators and other privacy campaigners have finally started to get on top of the advertising ecosystem, at least the older one. They've started to bring complaints, they've started to bring lawsuits, they've started to see action happening, and time feels like it's kind of coming to a head. It feels like it's maybe almost up for some of these older, more ridiculous business models that were blatantly illegal. And they're being replaced, though, by something a bit different. We find actors like Google reaped a huge amount of money from this open ad system, claiming they will move ads and advertising and targeting into their browser, Chrome. You find companies like Apple investing heavily in privacy-preserving advertising technologies and privacy-preserving machine learning technologies. In a way, this turns the advertising system inside out, where the data was exposed to everybody before. Now the data is exposed only to the browser, only to the device. And the company itself could, if presented with a warrant, say, hey, we can't give you this data. We don't know what adverts or websites people have been browsing. That's all held on their device. That's not held with us. So it's turning it inside out in the sense of making it more confidential. But firstly, it's not always more private. The targeting is still happening in a very similar way in these systems, envisaged to grab people's attention, envisaged to be personalized towards their interests, get them at the right moment. Psychologically, it's very similar. And that seems to be maybe something we should pay more attention to. Confidentiality does not solve problems of privacy. The second issue is that maybe it's not really turning these systems inside out. If you look at how open advertising and display advertising have worked in the past, well, they haven't been so open. These platforms, like Google, have set the rules of the game. They've built standards and technologies for real-time bidding that were integrated across the stack. And they reaped huge amounts of money in the process. But lots of other companies have got rich at the same time. Even if they're a bit more precarious, they don't have very deep infrastructure. Maybe they have some trackers and things embedded on a web page. It doesn't go much deeper than that. Companies like Meta don't have very much infrastructure. They're a very precarious, insecure company. Who owns a Meta product? Almost nobody who physically owns a Meta product. So they can be swept off an infrastructure just like a fly. And that worries them. That's probably why they invest in ridiculous headsets. This is also interesting because the new vision of privacy-preserving advertising is surprisingly, well, single player as far as games go. The game that these companies are playing is one where they set the standards and other actors don't really get much of a say. The reason that is because they've taken an infrastructural move to displace this piles of data that were flowing around, this metaphor of information being centralized, gathered and analyzed and then reaped into value. They've converted this to a protocol power. The power to get all these devices, browsers or phones to light up at the same time, and using privacy-preserving analytics, or rather confidentiality-preserving analytics, to produce the same kind of answers about those individuals, the same kind of targeting as you would have got were you to amass all that data together in one place. So you solve the confidentiality problem, but you maintain the other privacy problems around attention, autonomy, and so on. In fact, you maybe heighten them, because who's to say you can't start to look at gaze data, the way people are walking, their health status, their blood pressure and blood pulse. All of these kinds of things might be game and fair game for these companies, were they to say, this is all confidential, no one can see it. Lastly, this play, which has worried competition people, but should also worry privacy people, it does unnerve and upend some of the narratives we've had around privacy-enhancing technologies, and in particular, encryption. Encryption, seen by many digital rights organizations as effectively, like, you cannot dispute it. Effectively, it's something that should be off the table, it should be protected at all costs. And I think that's fair when it comes to encrypted communication between individuals. But I think it becomes a lot less difficult, and less easy to defend, rather, when you're encrypting business models and infrastructures, making them impermeable, making them difficult to work out if discriminatory ads are being sent, making it difficult to work out how companies are making money from online attention. That's what's happening at the moment in advertising. A conflation between encryption to help and secure individuals' freedom of expression and encryption in order to hide how businesses are functionally operating and optimizing populations. With that, it's going to be difficult to push a battle to protect encryption, because fighting for encryption isn't so obviously all good as people used to think it was. Just because encryption, the nature of what it can do, has changed, not the nature of behavior. We're now encrypting computation, analysis, optimization of populations. These are things that are not as easy to just take a clear stance on as expression of something very simple, or arguably simple as that. So with that, thanks a lot and enjoy the rest of the day.
Well, welcome everybody, and Corinne, thanks for organizing this panel and the book, of course. My name is Vicky Jansen, and as Corinne mentioned, I'm one of the co-PIs of the Critical Infrastructure Lab at the University of Amsterdam, and a postdoc also at the same university. And we, the three of us, came together to start the Critical Infrastructure Lab because we wanted to study sort of how power and conflict materializes in infrastructure, and sort of especially sort of how this is shaping society and which topics are not talked about or which solutions are not talked about, where we always sort of head in direction of profit and capital, and we forget to think about people and planet. And within our constellation, I look at the environmental impact of internet infrastructure. So this is also what my chapter will be about, and also the short intervention. So I think when we talk about environmental impact of internet infrastructure, for many people this is quite a new topic. And I think here in the Netherlands it started materializing in the public debates when Arjan Lubach had this show around what was happening in the Wieringermeer, how this data center was built of Microsoft, and it was gobbling up all this energy of a large windmill farm. That was sort of where, when they created this windmill farm, they said it was like local energy, green energy production for local consumption, where citizens were like, okay, maybe. And in the end, they're still dependent on fossil fuels, and all the green energy goes to the Microsoft data center that is currently being expanded there. Then last year we had the conflict around Zeewolde with Meta data centers for the metaverse. We have to build hyperscalers, and that was going to gobble up the same amount of energy as the entire city of Amsterdam. And I think here we primarily see disputes over energy. Whereas really, if we take a look on the global scale, actually the environmental impact of internet infrastructures have been known to many people, primarily in the global majority, for a long time. People who get confronted with lithium mines, cobalt mines, they also know the environmental damage upfront and well, they're first-hand sort of witnesses to it, but also sort of the production of silicon costs tremendous amounts of water. So the hardware that is required to for our infrastructures, they have a tremendous environmental toll. And still, it's quite a nascent field when we research this. And it really came sort of from computer science, saying, how much energy are we consuming? Can we optimize this? Can we change this? This slowly also started sort of in academia, the debate started shifting more towards a justice frame, like who is actually impacting and who is deciding what we can do about it. What is interesting is that there's a lot of sort of calculation happening in silos. So we think, for instance, how much energy does it cost to have one Zoom call? And can we then compare this on a spreadsheet to how much energy it costs to go to the office, for example, and have a similar meeting? As if it's either or. And I think people who've been studying the internet or digital technologies for a long time, they recognize this also about questions around discrimination and social justice, where for a long time sort of the debate was, is machine decision-making better or worse than human decision-making? And oftentimes they both suck, because we don't ask the really hard questions. So it's not an either-or. We really have to think about, if we center other values, what does it show us? And so in my chapter, I'm sort of dipping my toes into how, because this is one of my fascinations, how do policymakers and how does industry frame this problem? How do they frame the problem around sort of the environmental impact, but also what do they see as the solutions? Because this tells us a lot about what they don't see as solutions. So for instance, if you look at the big tech companies, they a few years ago came out with their climate pledges. So all the same companies that Michael Viel was talking about this ad tech market, this ever-expanding need for internet infrastructures for an advertising market. They were also releasing transparency reports about the energy consumptions and the water consumptions of these data centers. And so they're sort of fearing regulation, but also from internal pressure of people in these companies. The big tech companies decided to make climate pledges. But when you read these climate pledges really carefully, but also critical research that has been done about these climate pledges, you see that they really frame it in a specific way. So they frame it in, we become more sustainable because we use renewable energy. But as Lubach showed us, renewable energy also comes at a cost. It comes at a cost because other people don't use this renewable energy, but also all our renewable resources also require a huge amount of material resources that we mine in other countries, far away from where we are based now. So one answer was renewable, and actually it's only a small proportion of the energy they use. Most of it is actually done through carbon offsetting. So that is investing in sort of trees and other things. And the New Climate Institute, they did research about the top 25 companies using carbon offsets, of which Apple and Google and Amazon were in the top 25. And it really showed that hardly any of these carbon offsets worked. So part of this PR campaign and the climate pledges actually prevents them from doing something real. Because the only thing that we realize when we talk to engineers is that we do less. This is actually the only thing that works in sort of energy reduction. If you talk to an engineer in a telecom company, they will say, having studied this, is that the only thing that works is not optimization or renewables, it's actually shutting down a base station. Shutting down a part of the infrastructure is the only way in which we can reduce the use of energy consumption. But this is something that you will not see in the climate pledges of the big tech companies. The other thing that I also touch upon in my chapter is sort of how policymakers, and specifically the European Commission, how they frame the problem and the solution. So their understanding of the problem is, of course, a little bit more nuanced. So they see that there's a material impact of internet infrastructures and new technologies, specifically around sort of critical raw materials, but also natural resources like water and energy. But their argument is that at the end of the day, if we put it in a spreadsheet, the material harms of new technologies are less than what it can contribute by making other sectors sustainable. And having been, and I think the three people here will be bored about it because I often use this anecdote, having been on a panel with somebody from the Commission who's responsible for the AI Act, I say, okay, give me one example. How does sort of training all these AI models, how does this sort of help other industries get better? And if you look at it on a spreadsheet, and he said, well, we all know that it will save us from the climate crisis. And then the reason was because we can more efficiently spread pesticides, so our agriculture sector will become less polluting. It makes me quite sad that this is the solution that are being offered, because actually, if we look at it really critically, the only way to think through sort of how are we getting ourselves out of this climate crisis and the ecological crisis we're in is really to start thinking about limits and reduction and redistribution. And how do you do this in terms of infrastructure? How do you do this in terms of internet infrastructure? How can you think about less instead of more, which is very counterintuitive to how we have built our entire tech industry, which is only about infinity and more. And I think as soon as you center other values than just optimization, so we will use less energy but doing the same computing power, it opens up different discussions you can have. Do we actually need these data centers? Do we need to store all this data so that the ad tech business can continue running? Are there different data sets that we prioritize? So for instance, if we have, do we already have enough infrastructure? And if yes, what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize medical data or state data over, for example, a metaverse or something else? And can we also start thinking about regulation around this? And I think this was really something I was trying to push for in my chapter about how can we reimagine what we want our internet infrastructures to be, and how can we really center sort of the planet and social well-being rather than growth and capital, because that's the direction it's heading now. And what are then the options that are opening up? And I think there's a few very nice small examples where people have been trying to experiment with infrastructure infrastructures that are less polluting, for example, or based on different values. So you have the Low Tech magazine, but you also have Solar Protocol that sort of routes routes hosting of websites to where the sun is shining, and it's a collective sort of distributed network that does it. And I think the key is not that this will overtake industry, but it will show us a different way, that other ways are possible than just the centralized big tech monopolies that are setting the rules for how we view sustainability within infrastructure. That's it.
Hi all. This is great. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm also super thankful that you're all here on this rainy evening. And most of all, I'm thankful for Corinne. And it also just feels like my work is just continuously adding footnotes to the work of Corinne and Fieke. So it's greatly to follow on and to keep on jamming with them, because I do seriously think this is not like this obligatory say thank you, but that the way that we can counter corporate power is think communally. And sometimes the university has us think that knowledge is produced individually by getting your own citations and your H index. But with this work and the critical infrastructure lab and community work, I think we should show that we should undo this neoliberalized individualization, and that knowledge production for justice is a collective process. And for that, we need infrastructures. So for a while, we thought that the internet was kind of given to us a bit like the Holy Spirit was given out, and it would transform us into a better world, and we would just needed to receive it. But now we have like pushback. We see that this is not really working, and there are inherent imperial and colonial tendencies that are reproduced through these communication infrastructures. So now we get to ask, for what? Because as Fieke often says, the fourth industrial revolution is a collective suicide pact. If we continue like this, we will definitely not make any climate pledge, and the only thing we can do is see our own demise in 4K. So what are we going to do? So I've been studying internet governance and internet infrastructure for a while, and then I thought, wow, I only need to study telecommunication, and then I can write my book. Little did I know that history went back further than the beginning of the internet. It went back to early transnational communication networks. And who of you knows like the first undersea cable connecting the US and Europe? Which year? 1865. Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. So 1865, which was also the year in which the oldest still functioning international organization was established, which was then the International Telegraph Union, now the International Telecommunications Union, became in 1967 part of the UN, and thereby predating the UN, right? And the ITU governs all communication channels except the internet. Exactly. So all our communication channels used to be governed multilaterally, but the internet is governed in this multi-stakeholder fashion with massive more power by corporations. So I've been working for a long time to see if we could make human rights considerations an inherent part of internet governance. But having looked at that now for a while, and also looking at the current geopolitical situation, I see that over the world, human rights is not at the top of the agenda. So what can we do to make this a better system? We have a communal problem, and that is climate change. So perhaps we could leverage that to reform and reshape, and building on Fieke's agenda, to build a more just and more real and build technology that we actually need, so that we do not have ourselves be reconfigured by technology, but we reconfigure technology to serve us. And I've been doing this wrong myself for a long time. So a book I wrote together with Corinne and Mallory Nodal and Ulrike Ulik was a comic book about how the internet really works. And there we wrote a comic on all the technical layers. This is Maxigas, great compatriot, also co-founder of the Critical Internet, a Critical Infrastructure Lab, and also of the internet, obviously. So we wrote that comic, but try to get people to understand the internet But maybe this is wrong. We should get the internet to understand what we want. We should understand where the internet is in our lives. And this is what I tried to do in the chapter I wrote with Maxigas for this book, in which we described how we do infrastructure walks. So instead of looking at these satellite constellations, cables, international governance bodies, we look at how infrastructure is shaping our lives, how it's ingraining power, how it's setting the invisible rules that set our daily lives. And if infrastructure sets the invisible rules, then standards are the invisible grammar. So how do we get them, and how do we get these ordering principles, and how can we rewrite them and make new demands? And do that by looking at our own physical places and try to reconfigure them and re-own them. And also with that, gain a part of our democracy back. Because far too much has been encroached and has also taken away a possibility from us to actually set the priorities of what our lives and societies and infrastructures to look like. And it has been a pleasure and an honor to work on this together with you all. And of course, this is an ongoing process, right? And that's why I think it's so important that we create this space for community. Because there is not a point where it's like human rights are achieved. Rights are like muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them. But this is why we should exercise, and exercise in group, because that's way nicer, and we get way further. So this is more a call for more humans to do technology better. Thank you.
So my name is Hans, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about a concrete infrastructure, and a little bit of a story of how it can go wrong and how hard it is to sort of redress these wrongs. So during COVID time, in the educational world, there was this problem, which is that universities thought it was a difficult thing to do testing and to sort of make sure, to do testing at a distance, I should say. So they hired these companies that are called proctoring companies, which are basically anti-cheating software, or you could call it spyware, if you like. So basically you install it on your computer, it monitors everything, so your webcam, your microphone, what you're doing on the computer, etc. It's based on a browser, and people doing tests had to have this all installed, had to have perfect setup, perfect lighting, weren't allowed to have any other people in the room, couldn't go to the toilet, etc. So it's very, very shitty infrastructure that they were forced to use if they wanted to do their exams. And pretty soon it became very clear that an integral part of this proctoring was that you had to be identified in front of the computer as that there was actually a person there. And it used webcam images for that. And as anybody who's been paying attention knows, facial detection and facial recognition doesn't work as well for everybody. Basically, the darker your skin color, the more problematic, and often you're actually not seen at all. So there was these, there were lots of stories starting to appear of students of color throughout the world that couldn't log into their tests and had to basically adjust their lighting, in many cases actually put a light directly in their face before the software would say, would no longer say face not found. And so here in the Netherlands, there were 14 universities using a particular product called Proctorio that was very much known for these problems. And there's one student, Robin Pokorny, I should say, who suffered from these problems basically when she started to do the exams. The software would say face not found. And together with her, we filed a complaint with her university first, the Vrije Universiteit, the VU. And then they didn't address it properly, and we went to the Dutch Institute for Human Rights to file this complaint. And in their interim judgment, they first did an initial judgment where they said, yes, Robin has shown that there was discrimination, and they very recently, just 2 weeks ago, ruled that there was no discrimination, at least not in Robin's case. So they were like, we've looked at your login times, you were pretty fast, We don't know about the software because we haven't really looked at that. But you obviously didn't have any problems. And so the fact that we said, well, she didn't have any problems after the first 2 times because she realized that she was forced to do an exam with a light in her face didn't seem to register with the institute. But I want to focus not on that story, but on Proctorio and what it is. So there's one researcher. So you have to realize I find the software ridiculous. Like I would never use it. Yeah. So it's completely based on distrust. It's like this is how you organize education. It's very weird. There's one researcher who calls it cop shit. It's like why? It's like plagiarism software. I don't know why you would use these things, but universities do. And they use Proctorio, and Proctorio delivers it as software as a service. So basically, we very soon realized in this process that the VU had no idea how the software worked. They had no say about the software. They were completely dependent on Proctorio to deliver any information whatsoever. We also don't know how it works. Nobody knows how it works. You could reverse engineer it. So that's been done on 2 occasions. So one student in the US has done that. And recently here in the Netherlands, RTL News has done the same. So they downloaded the plugin, found out what facial detection models were in there, and then used those models against a diverse set of images to find out that, yes, indeed, it doesn't work the way it's expected to work. Proctorio keeps denying these things, so they have an audit report done by an independent AI auditor. The report is not public, but they say the report says that there's no bias. They also didn't add it to the court case. The VU was not allowed to put it in. They could only put it in if it was stayed completely secret for some unclear reasons. They are also like really in sort of an info wars strategy. So they create blog posts where they're debunking the research by RTL News or by this university student. They have all the information, so there's a complete asymmetry. So for example, during the trial at some point, they come up with chat logs that they'd had with the student that we were representing. She didn't have access to those chat logs. They suddenly appeared. They were stored against the privacy policies that were instituted. They are very aggressive in court, so they are really exercising their muscles in a way that is terrible. So there was one Canadian librarian who's very cute because he's a librarian, who's what? And Canadian. Well, yeah, okay. And so, and basically he was critical of the software. He posted a YouTube link from their training program, basically. So he posted a link. And they filed a copyright claim against him, a slap. So I think he now has 200,000 euros in dollars in lawyer fees later, and it's going probably to the Supreme Court in the US. And what is the most shocking thing about the whole thing is that Proctorio uses the whole language of ethics, fairness, debiasing. They even went so. So their language is actually insane. So their motto is privacy and integrity for today's digital learning, which is pretty absurd if your business is sort of looking into students' rooms. And what they also did, they wrote this blog post after the judgment. So basically, the Institute for Human Rights said we have there's no proof of discrimination with the software. Rowan wasn't discriminated in that case, but she was discriminated by the VU in how they handled her complaint. And so then Proctorio wrote this blog post, which was titled something like our commitment to our values and ethics, or something like that. And basically they said, yes, we've learned that one of our valued partners, the VU, has not treated a student decently, so we have immediately cancelled the contract with the VU. And they did this one-sidedly. which sort of shows the complete sort of dependence that these universities have on this type of software, the fact that they can really do nothing about it, and also that it's nearly impossible to fight it. So for me, the conclusion should be for any sort of educational institution that this is not a tech setup you want to have, it's not acceptable for people who are in a structurally powerless situation, which is what students are. So thank you.
Thanks so much. I think the conversation raised a bunch of different questions. And the first one I want to pose, each of you, comes from a theme that I'm hearing across your different talks, and drawing back from what Hans just said. This question of these new dependencies that are created as institutions like universities become much more dependent on software providers that are not just black boxes, but jerks from your talk. And
shameless and ruthless.
And one of the things that I wanted to ask each of you is how we can reckon with this new situation of discrepancy in power, information asymmetry, if, for instance, as Michael already alluded to, regular ways of working on tech issues, for instance, by being pro-encryption, don't fit well in this political economy. Which one of you?
The new dependencies. Well, I think internet and new technology has become the new dependency. What we see is that everybody wants to become a data company or use as a data company. But I think when I look at it from the environmental perspective, but I think it probably resonates with the others too, is that especially when we look at policymakers, I think there's a nice sense that it's like an easy way out. We are confronted with very complex problems where there is not one solution. There's like plurality is probably the answer. And we have to make some really difficult choices, things that people don't want to do. Like I talk very easily about limits, reduction and redistribution, but it raises a lot of sort of like uncomfortable feelings with people, anger, I don't want to give up what I have, not in my backyard politics. And I think by presenting sort of technology as the answer, I think we're trying to get a quick fix out of very difficult circumstances. Also with COVID, universities were also required to continue business as usual and teach students. And so maybe the software was an easy way out because maybe the other answers were too complicated to organize in a short time frame. So from the very small to immediate to maybe some larger scale problems, I think the dependencies are created because on one way it's an easy way out. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, good call. So I think we can learn also here again from history, right? So as the Hungarian author Rita Sajat shows in her book Reluctant Power, about the telegraph and era, is that companies are not loyal citizens. So like a US company will not necessarily play into the hands of the US state, right? So for instance, a lot of the surveillance system in Russia has been built by Nokia. Cisco has contributed to the building of the Chinese firewall. So there is complexity there. And we see there is also an increasing complexity in the technologies and infrastructures that we run, right? It's not easy for an individual. So who of you runs their own mail server, right? Does it get easier, harder, or does it stay the same? Yeah, right? And this is a relatively simple feature, relatively, right? So, and email is a thing that has stayed relatively the same. IMAP has not changed that much. So now we want more and more things, and it becomes harder also to ask from a university to run everything itself, because you have a lot of economies of scale if you can specialize. So how are we going to deal with that? How do we deal with specialization and the accessibility of knowledge? And here I go back to the human right to science, which is, where I think that the fruits of scientific progress belong to society. So I think it's very important that we used copyright, which is giving people the monopoly to make money of knowledge. We gave that for a long time. We used it exclusively to give that to companies, right? To harness innovation. But I think we should also be able to harness it to safeguard other rights. Because as you know, human rights are unalienable, indivisible, and interrelated. So I think we should rethink knowledge politics and take that expertise and specialization and know that if we're going to build our society on a foundation of privatized technological infrastructure, we should make that technological infrastructure auditable and understandable. Because else we are handing us consciously over to a black box. And sadly, many of you know in the audience, is like that the people who are running it, so sadly probably also proctorial people, don't know how their technology works themselves. This is the sadness of AI. It's like, we don't really know how it works, but it kind of does what we want to do, so let's go with it. That's not science, right? So, but that is what AI brings us now, and we should like very critically examine that and build accountability structures for that. And for that, not only approach this problem from a technical or economical lens, but also really from a strong accountability and legal lens. And I know, like, technology people think you can solve everything in technology, economists think everything is money, lawyers think everything is law, and you know, so like everyone loves their own specialization, but we cannot solve this problem in one way. And there I come back, we need to communally think about these complex problems if we want to continue to use technology and really ask, what are the boundaries that we want to set to technology if we're going to integrate it in every part of our life? Because it's there now. And it's very weird that we don't know how it works, and many people don't know how it works. Should I stop? Yeah, stop. Sorry, stop, Niels, stop.
It's interesting to see you switch from panel mode to professor mode, but I do want to hand over to Hans.
Yeah, I'll be a bit shorter. To me, these big tech companies, it is their model to make us dependent. So they are investing a lot of time, effort, thinking into doing that. I honestly believe we lost a major war, or a battle, I should say, probably, because we still have hope, or something. We lost a major battle during COVID. So I think in many domains, we've increased our dependence on big tech in a tremendous way, and that's not being rewound. So I think it should start with a politicization of these problems. So we need a politics of a technology that understands these dependencies and thinks about these dependencies and tries to be more autonomous or more sovereign, or all these terms that we like so much.
If only someone were to edit a book about the politics of internet infrastructure, Hans. If only. Fieke, you have another...
No, when Niels, but also Hans were talking, I was reminded of this conversation I had. So I also push a climate justice and digital rights coalition in the civil society space. And I was talking to some people working more from the environmental side. And they were saying, like, but how is like big tech different than any other industry? Like, can it even be compared to the fossil fuel industry, for example? And we're trying to come up with all these arguments and stuff. And all of a sudden, this person went, is like big tech is like the fossil fuel industries of the 60s, where it became the infrastructure of society, and of course it brought many things. But do we really want to leave sort of the development of infrastructure and sort of the regulation of infrastructure in the hands of the market? And now in my imagination, I can see if we fast forward to 30 years from now, there'll be people like gluing their hands to data centers, the way they are now gluing their hands to the A12. Because like we have to act now, while we're probably already way before, because otherwise we're fighting something that's already have become the backbone of society, and it becomes so difficult to later on bring in different values and bring in different perspectives. And I think this is part of the politicization of internet infrastructures.
So taking that suggestion and moving it forward, for each of you, what would politicization look like, and what does it take around these subjects, given that, as we've already discussed, these are not necessarily intuitive topics for people. These are not the parts of the internet that they engage with themselves. So how do you get infrastructure on people's proverbial radar?
Maybe you should write a book.
That is many things, but it is not the solution.
Yeah, so maybe to align with what Niels was saying earlier, that we should make the internet understand people, or what Vika was saying, that it is not an either-or question. Very often, both options are shitty. Let's create a new option. I think very often it is about asking. So technology can be very revealing for certain things. So basically, if I look at the very concrete example of this proctoring case, you could also say any educational institution that thought they really needed proctoring and couldn't organize it in another way has too much scale. They lost their proper educational functions. They apparently had 400 students per teacher or whatever. So they couldn't organize it in another way. So I think it is always about the interplay, about asking the questions about what do you want society to look like, or in this particular case, what is education for? And then you start thinking about, okay, how does that interact with the technologies around that and the infrastructures around that? But it starts with sort of having a very clear idea of what sort of society you want to have or want to be.
I'm going to make it a bit harder. Because the world is fundamentally broken, and it's breaking further every day. And that makes our lives and change very hard, right? And the internet kind of sort of works. So it's hard to convince people that we should put time and effort to change that. And previous communication networks, the first thing that would happen if a war would break out was that submarine cables would be cut. So right now, there is a war with Russia. We have cut Russian banks off the SWIFT network. So we live in post-capitalism, and we cut financial streams, but Russia is still connected to the internet. So somehow the internet is the global infrastructure. It's what keeps things together. So if we're now going to inscribe regional rules or national rules, there is a danger of undermining that fiber. And so then we can fix one problem but seriously hamper another. And that makes this problem even harder. But then again, the whole world has this problem ahead for climate change, right? So that might give us a common enemy, that might help us to work together to prevent the destruction of our species.
The collective
self-destruction.
The self-destruction.
Collective self-destruction.
So I think we can learn like this. I like this communal approach, and we can learn a lot from other movements. And I see Becky Kozenski sitting in the audience too, who is also a postdoc at the UvA and does really interesting work on the nexus between climate and tech too. And I think in one of the reports she wrote, she also mentioned we can learn a lot from the environmental movement about how we can push for defunding certain practices, how we can also push for stakeholder activism, because these are industries and we shouldn't treat them as consumer products, we should treat them as industries. So we should also, our engagement with them should also be accordingly. I also think that we have to also realize that refusal is an act. So when things seem to be too good to be true, they usually are too good to be true. The same as with this proctoring case. Also, professors and teachers should have stood up and said, no, we don't by default assume people are frauding. It is actually the values that we hold, and we have to stand up against power and against also viewing things a certain way. Because I think as soon we have to get out of certain frames to be able to see other opportunities and be able to do other fights. And whether that's really on a small scale level or a grassroots level, like I got really inspired when Maxigas, our colleague, were like, I don't understand why states don't invest in post-silicon computing. And I was like, I never thought about this fact of post-silicon computing, because we always invested in a certain type of hardware and not in R&D for other types of hardware. And I think it's really about sort of refusal is not about saying no, but about seeing what other ideas and forms of knowledge can open up if you refuse sort of the dominant discourse. That sort of fraud is at the center of how we engage with students, or that sort of growth is at the center of how we engage with infrastructures. So I think it's like learning from other movements, but also sort of having this check about refusal that I think we all have this feeling when it's like, this is quite easy. And I think that should be a trigger warning.
I really appreciate that. I'm going to ask each of you one last question before we open it up to the audience that tries to do a little bit more of what you were already doing, namely, there's a lot to be gloomy about. But I was wondering if there's any work that you know, any organizations, any people who are trying to intervene and build a better internet, or an internet that's better for people, that you are excited about, that you're researching, that you're working with, etc.
I think the work Sanne is doing with the justice table, connecting civil society from all over the world in a fight for justice, is super inspiring. And there are a lot of people are waking up to these topics and are ready to organize. And I find that inspiring, and I'm with Gramsci, right? It's like a pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Here we go. Like, hope is a revolutionary obligation, and it's easy to sulk, but sulking is also a privilege, right? So let's get at it and be nice for each other, because it will be a while.
Oh wow.
And talk to Maxi about organic computing. Buy him a beer and you'll have a great evening. Yeah.
I think there's many like really small initiatives that are really exciting. You have the Green Web Foundation that's trying to do is trying to do things differently. There's like people coming together to sort of see what decolonized feminist infrastructures could look like. There's people who are trying to bring indigenous knowledge to the table, and I think all of these things are very exciting, even if it's just like to put a mirror in front of your face and sort of start thinking differently. So I think the challenge is where to find it and where to find your community, and how to move forward. And this is by both looking in your immediate surroundings and also like internationally. But I think here with like local organizing, what I think it's always important to realize is also what sort of the ripple effects are to other communities, whether these are positive or negatives, and sort of how can you bring them into your conversation.
For me, personally, also because that is the level I operate on the internet very often, which is just applications that I can use. It is the people and the projects that have decided that they want to commit significant resources into building free software. and create amazing products that have no limitations on their use, that anybody can use. And they exist also in the educational domain. They exist in sort of infrastructural domains, of course, everywhere. So that would be my shout out.
Perfect. On that note, how do we do the Q&A? Great. Any questions here in the front?
Thank you. Who could hear me? Yeah, in the microphone. I noticed Mr. Tenuver mentioned about we should need to understand the internet should understand us. And I hope that was just a figure of speech, that he wasn't too literal about that, because if he was, he's asserting that the internet is somehow sentient, and that's a very interesting question these days. But that's just to introduce my question. It's about AI, and about how AI is going forward at a breakneck pace. No one can seem to stop it, except that there's one obstacle that's loomed, and that's the issue of copyright. Now we have all sorts of authors and film and music producers, really ex post facto, because the offense has already been committed, suing to say, hey, you used this without my permission, I should get some sort of payment for that. So my question is maybe that could be some way to slow down or to put a little bit of accountability and responsibility into the runaway or the dominance of technology, especially AI that he was mentioning. Although, let me finally suggest that the possibility that someday a US court or even the Supreme Court will rule that actually it's all okay. You can't sue because it's the doctrine of fair use. That's a American legal concept of fair use, meaning that to a certain degree, all of us can use copyrighted material as long as there's not too much. What if some court said, hey, there's no problem here, AI companies, do your thing because it's fair use the way that you use this sort of data.
Okay, so copyright as a stopgap measure.
Fuck copyright. No, like if my rights have to depend on copyright as a stopgap, then I think we can just stop right now. So to me, it's a completely irrelevant question whether it's allowed or not. And I like creators. That's not the issue here.
Is this me? Yes? Yeah. When I said the infrastructure should understand us, I mean the infrastructure. My understanding of the internet as an infrastructure is inherently relational. So often sometimes we go to schools and talk to children about the internet. And I was with an internet engineer, Shane Kerr. He's a DNS god, and these kids asked, if humans are not here, how long will the internet run? And we just laughed, But it makes so much sense, right? Because there is so much talk about the sentience, but we all know it's duct tape and chewing gum, and so the internet is run by humans that know who to call, have practices, have a culture. Corinne wrote a book about it. It's very good. And so the internet is an inherently human thing. And it's not as much technology as we hope it is. And the same is true for AI. And I think this was and is true about cryptocurrencies and all that stuff as well. And we now see with Sam Bankman-Fried who these people are and what they were doing and what they were not doing. This is not okay, right? It's we know it's clowns running the circus, but, no. So we should be far better at saying no to stuff and having the way to saying no to stuff and practice that as a community. Because so for a long time we thought if it's free, you're the product, right? It's free because they were selling us crack, right? So that we all got used to it and got integrated and we got and that's there. So they're not even selling us because our private information is not worth as much as we think, right? They might sell us showing an ad 0.0001 cent. They will still gamble for it, But the real thing is like, it's going for acceptance. And if we do the self-tracking, it's also normalizing mass surveillance, right? And we just have seen it pass Parliament again, even though there was a referendum on this legislation. And the political parties that said that they were against it have now actually just like turned around and said, here you go. So we also have a lot of work to do with our representatives to mainstream the digital agenda. And when people talk about the digital, they talk a lot about the things they can see, about Facebook, about Google. But there is a whole layer underneath that is much harder to make rules about. And then the interests of these companies are often still interwoven. Because when they see then Thierry Breton trying to set up telco transfer taxes to get more money to the telecommunication companies at behest of the hyperscalers, like these are both the enemy. You know, so we should build accountability structures for that and talk about the infrastructure we want and we need.
Yeah, maybe I'll leave the copyright discussion to Hans, but I think what you're pointing to is maybe what I like is sort of like we are all focused on AI now and these big companies and where we're heading, but sort of we have had these tools already for a long time to curtail these big companies from becoming big tech and becoming sort of dominant players, because one, we've never let them pay taxes. We've always given them the easy way out. They've been sort of exempt in the Communication Act in the US that gives them a very specific status that allows them to other things that, for instance, media companies are not allowed to do. And I think so in this entire discussion also about how do we regulate AI, we have to realize that the state has both been the seed investor in a lot of these technologies, has sort of given them all these tax exemptions, and is allowing these companies to do a lot of things and saying, oh, we don't know where it's going and we don't know where it's heading. So I don't think copyright's the way to go. But I do think we've had ample opportunities to actually sort of have some grip on this industry, that we have failed as a society. And I think sometimes we have to look towards other pieces of legislation that exist to actually be able to make progress.
Thank you. Any other questions from the room? Yeah, in the back. Hey, Agusti.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful event, and I'm looking forward to read the book. I just wanted to pick up on something that Fika said when she compared these very large digital providers to the fossil companies of the 60s. There's been quite a lot of work done recently saying that kind of like our political structure, called liberal democracy as it emerged in post-war period, was very much tied to those type of energetic infrastructures. So the work of Andreas Malm, Timothy Mitchell. So I was wondering, particularly through Fika, but through all the panelists, what they see as the digital democracy question mark of the next 30, 40 years if we don't manage to stop the train right now. Thank you.
I don't know if I have a good answer to this. I think maybe what the authors with also the fossil fuel industry were hinting at is that the state and these companies have always been intertwined. You can actually not see them as separate entities. And I think something similar is happening where there's been a push and pull where we're like, oh, we're investing in you, but you cannot get too far. We want to sort of curb all the harms. And I think something similar is happening now with the digital economy, where we have the DSA, the DMA coming up. We have the AI Act that's going to be, that's being discussed at the moment. But at the same time, we're also investing billions in a European homegrown AI market, for example. That will be good by itself because it's rooted on European values. So I think sort of here we see a similar probably engagement happening where on the one hand the state sees sort of digitization as a key for economic progress and that society will not be able to continue, or we will not be able to keep up with our current means of living if we don't continue investing in digitization, and then specifically in this digital race we're having with the US and China, which Europe is not a player in, but we still believe we're a player in. And on the other hand, we also want to ensure well-being of people, so we put up some regulations that it doesn't become too extreme. And I think this will continue, because I'm not seeing any other political climate at the moment emerging that has any different sort of understanding about how digitization is integrating in our society. And I think it will only become more on steroids, because what we saw in the AI Act, but also in this idea about merging the twin transition, is that the Commission really wants to also have public services disclose all their data, so that we can actually have data to train a European AI market on it, so where the state becomes consumer. But we also see that they're trying to push it in other industries. So where they say agriculture, transport, and healthcare are sort of the first three priority areas after state services. So I think this integration between big tech and sort of the state, only, at least in Europe, will only become more intertwined.
Niels?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of state policies, where it comes to technology policy, is based on fear and very similar to nuclear arms race. So, for instance, if we look at quantum technologies, which I know some people might have studied here in the audience, is like, if you talk to quantum standardization people, it's 20 years before we might even have something potentially useful. But still, we don't want China to first reach quantum supremacy, do we? So that's why we set up the yes, exactly. So this is why we have the Dutch quantum delta, in which we need to invest. And the same is true for, we will need European AI, and we need European hyperscalers, because else the Americans have it. And this is just a race to the bottom, right? Because you won't get there. So I think we as academics, or some of you here who are academics and members of civil society, we do have two important roles. And one is like, question these entanglements. You think like, do we actually need quantum? And is this the investment we need? And where will this lead to, right? Is this bringing us to the society we need? What is this doing for inequality? What is this doing for our democracy, right? Is this what we need? But also, what is driving that we think we really need this? And then secondly, we also need to imagine alternative futures. So when I was interviewing one of the standards directors for one of the largest European telecommunication operators, I was doing research into 5G, and I asked this person who was French, so what is 5G optimized for? And he smiled and he sat back and he said, well, 5G, it's not optimized for anything. It's optimized for everything. And I was like, but he said, we're trying different earning models in different markets to see what sticks. So it's not a vision. It's not like the Cartesian Malin Genie, like someone with a roadmap. No, it's just people trying things out. So actually, there is a lot of lack of time and lack of fantasy in other spaces. So the people who have time and who have the imagination, we should come up with alternatives for what we want technology to look like and what we want to demand from it.
Thank you. Any questions from the room? If not, I have one more before we close off, which is each of you have been involved in different efforts working with civil society. You have the Racism and Tech Center that you're co-running with a bunch of wonderful people. And you've also all engaged with the municipality here in Amsterdam on these specific issues of internet infrastructure. This is exactly what I'm getting at, Hans. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, given that you have this view both of engaging in global politics, like the global standard-setting bodies that you've been working on, Niels, and the hyper-local of the city of Amsterdam, where have you had success, or where do you see opportunities for rebuilding and reimagining internet infrastructure technologies? you were smiling, so you get to go first, Hans.
Specifically in the municipality or here in Amsterdam?
Your choice. You tell me.
No, yeah. So I think it's an important point to realize that it's not evil geniuses with a terrible plan, and that's also the case for the municipality. They're not people there who are trying to think about how can we ruin people's lives by implementing algorithms. But there is this, so I met the other day one program manager who was leading 2 Accenture consultants that were doing debiasing stuff. And he basically said, and we were talking about a project, a pilot that they did that I sort of advised against, and then they still continued, but now they don't want to continue anymore because they realized that maybe the criticism was correct, and they are reframing the story. It sounds very cynical. So now they're gonna tell the story of how they tried to do everything right from the beginning, and they use the cutting edge tools for debiasing and explainable algorithms and all these sort of things, and that they still realized through their careful piloting that it couldn't fly, and now they will use a different approach, and hopefully other people can learn from this. So this is actually a good story hidden in a cynical blanket, for which I apologize. And he also told me, which I found like amazing, is he's like, yes, you have these, you have a, what was it called, so something analytics team, and yeah, they have to do something. It's garbage. So there's also this. They have expertise, and then they want people to apply it. They want to use these new, and maybe that's an interesting. That was really the shocking lesson for me, was that they are using all the tools that are being developed in the whole responsible IT space. They're just using them and are legitimizing their work with that. And so it's perfectly feasible to make something that is really, really terrible while it being explainable and fully debiased. So you need to be aware.
Wil je over de politie praten?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't want to talk about the police. If I'm going to stick to the data centers and the environment stuff. I think I agree with Hans. These are not evil geniuses. I think everybody really, especially also when we look towards sort of the environmental crisis that we're confronted with, I think people actually do want to do the right thing. But these are also, in the frame we're currently in, these are difficult choices. And here also people in the municipality, but also on the national state level, feel they have very little choice or very little power. So if we look at the data centers that are in Science Park, they also have a conundrum because they cool with clean drinking water, which is of course completely crazy that we cool an industry with clean drinking water. But the alternative is that we clean it with groundwater, which also has huge implications. And we actually don't know what's worse for the environment, whether we cool with clean drinking water or with groundwater. And so as a city official, you are stuck with, there's 2 options and we don't actually know which one is worse. And the one that's not on the table is that maybe these data centers should be reduced or limited, or they should be thought in a different way. There's another data center that uses excess heat for city heating, which is of course also nice. So there are, it is really difficult to sort of, if we are stuck with these data centers are here, there's nothing we can do about it, or these data centers will only expand, there's nothing we can do about it, then these problems become very difficult because there is no easy answer. And I think this is also what people in the municipality realize. And they also realize that maybe they have power in sort of permits and zoning and things like this. But once they're already there, there's less power. They're also waiting for a national government to come up with a data center strategy. So it is very difficult, and people will want to do the right thing, but there are very challenging questions. And I see the same in industry with engineers. They are trying to come up with solutions, but the solutions are all sort of rooted in this more is better. And so we optimize our energy consumption and water consumption. And I think, like, collectively, we have to start having these conversations that are different, because, like, city heating, great with excess heat, but do we actually need to store our Netflix series that close, or do we need to do all of this so that we cool with clean drinking water? And I think these are really difficult challenges that actually we cannot only say that somebody in a city is responsible for this.
Perfect. Niels, last words. I'm also going to ask you to keep it somewhat short so people can go home on time.
Difficult me. So like on a global level, extremely hard, because there's geopolitical tension, economic tension is like, it's nearly, in the Netherlands, it's hard because I'm also extremely Dutch, right? So it's asking a fish, how does the water feel? But so there are a lot of people that are working on it and are doing great stuff, but we have this problem in the Netherlands that's like somewhere between pragmatism and opportunism that I will now just shortly label toxic solutionism. So like, we want to have a solution, so we need to engineer our way out of this. We need to, so like, saying like, maybe we should just rethink the question. It's not in our nature, and I think we should get better at that, to maybe just like reverse and see if we can park it differently, and that could then maybe be the basis for a real knowledge innovation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, on that note, it just leaves me to hand each of you a copy of the book. And thank you again, and ask the audience to join me in thanking our panel here and you all for being here tonight.